All right, everyone, welcome to the 1-4 review video. You've got a nice little spate of poems that you read. We've got the mirror essay, and we'll open up with Ecology and Community by Capra. So we'll go over the basic ideas of Capra, why these are scientific ideas, but they're basic ones that we can use to analyze and even critique or evaluate what any given piece of not only literature for this course is saying, but any document or anything in the world, any situation or scenario that you might come across in the workplace in the future, in your own life, if you're an activist at all. But what we're learning from Capra is a way of reading the world. And of course, we can turn that into written words as well and evaluate those. But it's a very powerful scientific way, based in the needs of science and society. And that's what we get from Capra, and it's a way of using the needs of science or the ways of science and the needs of society to evaluate texts and ideas in life. And so that's what we're doing today. We do it on poetry, of course, because we're in a literature course, but this is for life after college as much as anything else, for your professional lives and your personal lives. So let's dive right in. He talks about the importance of community, and it connects it to people's emotional and spiritual well-being, future of children's survival, which is kind of what sustainability is, let's face it. He says we don't really understand the laws of sustainability as we do the laws of gravity. We haven't studied them as long, and that's part of what he's trying to teach us early in the essay. Do notice that he's basically saying if we want to fit in with nature for survival or sustainability, we might need to adopt some of its ways of living. One of the easy suggestions that comes up in here that you see repeatedly and that I mentioned in the preview video is linear systems versus cyclical systems, right? Are we producing a lot of waste that can't be reused? That can create environmental and health problems, right? And certainly that's not how an ecological community lives. But if we want to delve a little bit farther, let's just talk about relationships. As relationships, these are ideas that we can use in the future, that there's many species. This is known as biodiversity, of course. They are interdependent upon one another, what does that mean? Well, it means that removing one affects the others, right? He says that in the simplest, they eat one another. But he points out some flaws in thinking. That could be flaws in our own thinking, potentially. That the food cycle is not a chain. It's not just that the littler things get eaten by the bigger things and so on and so on, but that it loops back around, and the big thing gets eaten by the little things, right? And the waste is taken care of. That's really what we want to think of, to keep this on a simpler yet more universal level, that the waste is not actually waste, but gets put back into the system in some ways. He points out that science doesn't have a long history of doing this. This is fairly modern in some ways, even though he does give us a history of it going on over thousands of years. But he says science is better and more practiced at weighing and measuring things, right? And then he says that we can map relationships, and when you see enough configurations that are similar, you have a pattern, right? So one thing he talks about next is form and pattern then, since we've identified patterns. If there's reoccurrences, you have a pattern. He talks about that science has a history with substance, weighing and measuring things and isolating the objects, but that isn't how you study relationships, of course. It's based on interdependence, so the lack of isolation. So this leads to a big question. What is the pattern of life? Well, he offers some examples. There's ecological communities, whole systems. You can think of a marsh or a forest or whatever you'd like to think of, even a park in the middle of a city. But each member has a network of organs, etc. But here's the big thing. Networks are nonlinear. They go in every direction, can move back to their point of origin as well, right, as we talked about previously. He also talks about feedback loops. This becomes important because when influence travels through the loop and comes back, self-regulation begins, and self-organization or even reorganization potentially begins. So a system or a cycle can regulate itself, right? It can adjust, it can learn from its mistakes. I think adjustment is probably a nice word to use. If you say adaptation, it starts to sound like evolution, but systems do over time adapt, and that's how evolution happens, right? So self-organization then is part of a network pattern and part of the adjustment and adaptation. And he says that self-organization is one answer to this question, what is the essence of life? Well, nature self-organizes. Ecosystems self-organize based upon their needs, right? And so that's one big important concept for a course, self-organization. we'll look at how this is distorted later if we're looking to the future. Self-organization can be used poorly too, and people say, well, we can dump anything we want in the ocean. It'll just adjust, right? But ecosystems can become broken as well. So people use sort of the framework of self-organization to justify really horrible environmental decisions because, well, nature will get over it. Like nature's can just walk it off, so to speak. But there's a certain amount of pollutants that at some point you can't walk off and also affect human health. So look for this as sort of a defense for poor environmental activity as well, even though it's borrowed from the sciences, which is what makes it so powerful, right? So what are some basic ideas to remember here? This nice list right here. Interdependence, network relationships, the cycles, the webs, closed systems that reuse its own waste, right? That's linear v cyclical type of thinking or systems. And then self-organization. These are the things that we can pull forward into all of our readings in the future, and that again you can use to evaluate basic environmental situations in your life in the future, even if you're not an ecologist or have a background in science. Let's talk about our first poem, Stafford's Traveling Through the Dark. First thing I might say about this is it's a poem with no answers or conclusions. Remember I said this is a poem that I'm starting off with because we're sort of stuck with what to do with the environment and our relationship with the environment. And we can conceive it so many ways. That's what this whole course is about. And so the first thing we might ask of the poem is we might look at the title and the first line, Traveling Through the Dark. I think that is what the poem is about. We don't have the answers. That's a nice metaphor. When we don't know what we're doing or what to do next, we say we are traveling through the dark. I'm in the dark on this one. I don't know what to do, right? And so this is a speaker that doesn't know what to do. When we look at the end of the poem, we can see, I thought hard for us all, my only swerving, right? So it seems like the answers were easy in some way, and the swerving begins here with the hard thinking, right? Or that life doesn't always present these situations, right? We don't think about our responsibility to the environment, in this case, wildlife or life in general, our connections with the life around us. And so because we're not thinking of it, we don't have any swerves in our thinking. And so that's another way to read this ending, is that finally, at this moment, the situation shows him just how connected he is with the world around him and has an effect on life, the ecosystem, etc. And that causes him to finally swerve, to stop and think about it and say, what is the proper thing to do? And so the swerving here doesn't seem negative, but it seems like sort of a shock into awareness, some things we don't think about much. And then, of course, we have the conclusion of the poem. And we could say that this sounds kind of hopeless, that he pushed this doe with the fawn in the belly over the edge. But it also shows that sometimes there's not much humans can do. Maybe this is something larger, a larger problem that he can't respond to in some way, right? And so again, it's a poem with no answers in the end. We have action, but we don't have an answer. This isn't a poem that says, here are a bunch of environmental values and please live by them. This is someone who's moving through a challenging situation and makes a decision, one of many options, none of which seem easy or ideal in some way. And so again, this is a nice poem showing us the state of things in our relationship with the environment. Interesting, you do get some commentary on modern life. He says, when he finds it here, he says, it's usually best to roll them into the canyon. The road is narrow, to swerve might make more dead. Notice swerve, and we see that appear at the end, right? So life comes with easy answers. Usually you just throw them in the canyon. That's what you do with dead wildlife. So we see humans have an effect on the wildlife, and usually you just get it out of the way, get this life that's now dead out of the way, and don't think about it too much, meaning our effect on the environment. Don't swerve in your thinking. Just keep doing what you're doing, right? Don't move into awareness. That's one way we could read this first stanza, because he does swerve at the end, right? I love the tail light. It's worth pointing out that this tail light is red. It's sort of this birth scene, yet it's a death scene. He's stumbling around back there. Seems a little confused, stood by the heap, right? So this again seems like a sort of a mess. He doesn't know what to do with it. We then start to get some sort of moral implications in life, though here we can't just see it as a mess. We can't just stumble around, or he is stumbling around because he doesn't have answers, right? But we have to start to see it as life, a recent killing, right? then we get even more life as that ends. So this seems to be confusion, but he's coming to an awareness of what has happened. And it moves from something that was just sort of a mass of something into something that was alive, right? Into something that is alive. And so this is his movement into awareness in this stanza. It's interesting. This is where he has more knowledge of the fawn. He's starting to think about life and what to do, how to make a decision. It's interesting here in that the car sort of becomes merged, purred, the steady engine purrs, right, becomes merged with this scene here. Now we could say that this is a replacement for animals in our very human world, that the animals are purring or something like that. Or maybe this is a scene where he's having sort of a moment of unity. That would be another way of reading this, that everything here is sort of alive and part of a system, and he's trying to figure out what to do next because he is in charge of this system. Or another way to read the poem is he's not. He's not in charge of the system. He doesn't know what to do. There's no easy answer. There's no way to adapt. And so we're left with just action, but we don't know if that action is good or bad. It just is. We're acting without thinking, or we don't have easy answers. And so that's sort of the gist of this poem as you work through these paragraphs. Let's talk about the Wallace Stevens poems. Let's talk about the first one, Earthy Anecdote. I think this is a good one where we can start to apply some of the ecological concepts to this poem. Seems like an awkward fit at first, but I think we'll actually see a nice fit between a few things. So in Earthy Anecdote, what do we have? The reason I included this poem is because we do have some patterns in the poem, not only poetic patterns, like we have this clattering throughout the piece, right? But we also have the patterns of the movement of the animals. They moved in a swift circular line to the right, or until they swerved in a swift circular line to the left, because of the fire cat, right? And so you have these nice patterns in the poem, but also in the animal behavior itself. So that's something we can do in an ecological reading, is show that, hey, these are sort of hardwired behaviors. And that gets us down to sort of a theme in this poem. And this is a fairly typical theme of this poet, that chaos is not really chaos, especially, in nature or in the world, that everything becomes harmonized in some way. So although it looks like chaos, all this running back and forth, and it could even be seen as a chase scene. Is this fire cat there? Is it chasing the buck? We never know for sure, but if it is, it seems like a chase scene. A chase seems chaotic, right? A hunt seems chaotic and sort of frenzied, but it's not in the way it's discussed here. Everything is moving along in its perfect predictable order, even a hunt, right? It runs this way or it runs that way. The world is very, very predictable. And so we can read this that way. It's chaos is not chaos, right? It's all patterns and form. And that's fairly typical of Stevens. One interesting thing is, either this is, we could read this as the fire cat chasing, I suppose, the buck. Or we never really know if they're actually in contact with each other. Stevens might just be showing us a world where the bucks are running and this fire cat is out there somewhere. They're all doing their ecological business, right? And they're not even in contact with each other. We have this line because of the fire cat, but maybe they're aware of each other. They're part of the same ecosystem. So the behaviors, the long-term behaviors of the buck are based upon all of the evolution that went into this buck having strategies to sense danger and run away from potential danger, right? And so you don't need to see the cat. The buck doesn't need to see the cat to run away. It's just hardwired to run at the sense of danger, right? So it ran to the left or to the right and then to the left because of the fire cat, but not because it was there, but because it was scared. It's hardwired through evolution, right? So that's a way to use some of the ideas of ecology to read this poem. But in the end, poetry is always about themes. And one of the themes that comes out of this then is chaos is not chaos in nature at all. It is pattern and form. And those are things that we see in poetry a lot as well, pattern and form, right? And the last thing we might see is in the last lines, the fire cat is unconcerned whether it hunted successfully or didn't hunt successfully or was not even hunting. Nature doesn't have the same concern. It's part of, the fire cat is part of the ecosystem. It's had this day, so to speak, in its life, but it is at peace with itself because in ecological balance, it's living inside of its system. This is very unlike traveling in the dark, where we have the human predicament of how to live with nature, in balance with nature, care for nature, steward nature, right? And so the ending of this poem with the fire cat, very different than that human at the end of Traveling in the Dark.